This happened during the Second World War, and you are going to be shocked for a reason that has nothing to do with explosions or victory parades. It is shocking because it is gentle. It is shocking because it is kind. It is shocking because it happened in the middle of one of the harshest winters on the Western Front, when men were freezing, bleeding, and losing their way in forests where a single wrong step could mean death. And yet, on Christmas Eve, a small, hidden event unfolded that some people later called a Christmas truce. Not a grand ceasefire across a front line, not an official agreement signed by generals. A quiet, human truce inside one cottage, held together by one mother, one boy, and a room full of soldiers who chose, for one night, not to kill each other. If you like documentary stories that feel unbelievable, but are real, subscribe to the channel and write a comment telling me what kind of true history you want next. It helps the channel grow, and it tells me what to research and narrate for you. Now let us set the stage clearly, because the setting is part of what makes this so hard to believe. Late 1944 was not a calm time. It was not a time of stable lines and predictable days. Germany had launched a massive counteroffensive in the West. The battle remembered as the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, a storm of movement, snow, confusion, and brutal close-range fighting. The Western Front in that winter did not resemble the trench lines of the First World War, where men could stare at each other day after day across a fixed strip of ground. Instead, it was forests and villages and narrow roads. Patrols collided at short distance. Units got cut off. Men wandered for days trying to find their own lines. In that kind of war, fear becomes the air you breathe. And when fear is constant, trust usually disappears. That is why the story begins, not with soldiers, but with civilians. A mother and her child. A small home. A door. His name was Fritz Winken. He was 12 years old. He was German, and he had grown up in a world where war had become normal before he was old enough to understand what normal was supposed to feel like. His family lived in Aachen, a city near the western border. By late 1944, Aachen had been battered and partially destroyed by fighting. Civilians that learned a terrible kind of math. How many steps from the shelter to the street? How many minutes between sirens? How many pieces of bread could become a meal if you pretended you were not hungry? And when the fighting got close enough, the most important calculation became simple. Do you stay or do you leave? Fritz and his mother left. They did not flee because they were cowards. They fled because they were human, and because a mother has one job that becomes sacred in a collapsing world: keep the child alive. They moved away from the shattered city and into a small cottage near the Hürtgen forest. The forest itself had a reputation even before the Ardennes offensive, a grim place of mud, cold, and hard fighting. But the cottage was at least a roof. It was a stove. It was for walls. It was a table. It was, in a war that was swallowing cities, the smallest form of safety. For a short time, the area felt quieter than Aachen. Winter settled in. Snow covered the ground. Days became short and dark. The forest looked still, but stillness in wartime is not peace. Stillness is often just a moment between waves. Fritz learned to listen for distant gunfire the way other children listen for church bells. He learned to notice aircraft as shadows crossing the sky. He learned that adults become silent in a different way when the front approaches. A silence that is not calm, but concentrated. 9 days before Christmas, that silence changed shape. The German offensive in the Ardennes began, and the region around them started to pulse with war. Fritz would later describe the days before Christmas as a time of constant artillery rumbling in the distance, aircraft passing overhead again and again, and searchlights slicing the night. In the mind of a child, the night sky was no longer a place for stars. It was a place for beams and engines and the fear that something might fall out of the darkness. Then came Christmas Eve. Fritz and his mother tried to keep a small tradition alive. They had saved a rooster and potatoes, hoping for a modest holiday meal and for the possibility, however fragile, of seeing Fritz's father again. It was not luxury. It was an act of defiance against despair. When you set aside food in a starving winter, you are not just saving calories. You are saving a symbol. You are saying, we are still a family. We still mark time. We still remember that there are days meant for warmth. The stove was working. The pot was warming. The cottage smelled like simple food and with smoke. Outside, snow lay quiet, but the distant guns reminded them that quiet could shatter at any moment. Then there was a knock at the door. It was not a casual knock. It was urgent, controlled, desperate. Fritz went to the door and opened it. 3 American soldiers stood in the cold. One of them was badly wounded. That single detail changes everything. A wounded man at your door is not a political problem. It is a human problem. It is the oldest kind of question any person can face. Do you help or do you turn away? The Americans were lost. They had become separated from their unit in the chaos of the fighting. They had been wandering through the forest for days, hungry, exhausted, and trying to avoid German patrols. Their faces were unshaven. Their eyes were heavy with fear and fatigue. Without their heavy coats, Fritz later remembered, they looked less like the enemy posters and more like big boys who had stumbled into a nightmare. Fritz and his mother did not speak English. The Americans did not speak German, but they found a bridge through French. It was enough for the basics. They were hungry. They were cold. One was wounded. They needed help, and the world outside was too dangerous to survive another night without shelter. Now imagine what Fritz felt. He was 12. He had lived through years of wartime fear. He knew enough to understand that helping enemy soldiers could be considered treason. Even a child in that Germany knew the harsh truth. If the wrong people discovered you sheltering the enemy, you might not live to explain yourself. Fritz understood the danger with the raw clarity only a child can have. This was not a moral puzzle in a classroom. It was a knife edge. His mother made a decision anyway. She let them in. She brought them into the warmth, into the small light of the cottage, into the only place she controlled. She laid the wounded soldier on Fritz's bed. Through strained French, names emerged. Fritz remembered them as Jim, Robin, and Harry, the wounded one. Harry's face was pale as the snow outside, and his breathing was heavy, uneven. The kind of breathing that tells you a body is fighting for its place in the world. Jim and Robin sat near the stove, hands extended toward the heat, shoulders hunched, trying to thaw without appearing threatening. They were polite, quiet, and visibly frightened. And Fritz, watching them, noticed something that propaganda tries to hide. They were young. They were not monsters. They were scared boys with rifles, far from home, lost in a forest that did not care what language they spoke. Fritz's mother began preparing the meal, potatoes and rooster. While she worked, she tried to make the Americans feel safe enough to breathe, but not so safe that they forgot where they were. She was balancing fear and compassion like a tightrope walker. She was doing the work that were never celebrates, keeping a fragile peace inside a small room. Then the second knock came. The second knock in wartime is never just a sound. It is a sentence waiting to be spoken. Fritz opened the door again, expecting perhaps another lost American, or maybe nothing, or perhaps hoping the sound would stop. Instead, he saw for soldiers in German uniform. WEHRMACHT. German soldiers in the cold, armed, tense, and exhausted. Fritz froze with fear, not relief, because he understood the law of the moment. Hiding enemy soldiers could mean execution. He knew what might happen if these men stepped inside and saw Americans by the stove. He knew his mother could be shot. He could be shot. The Americans could be shot. The cottage could become a place of blood and screaming on Christmas Eve. The German patrol leader, a corporal, spoke to Fritz's mother. They had lost their regiment in the chaos, and they wanted a place to rest until dawn. He asked for shelter. He did not come as a conqueror banging down doors. He came as a soldier who had been walking along through cold darkness and needed a roof. Fritz's mother did something that seems impossible. Even now, she opened the door wider. She said yes. She said they could come in and eat while there was still food in the pot. Then she added a sentence that could have killed them all if the corporal reacted badly. She told him there were already 3 guests inside, guests he might not consider friends. And she declared that it was Christmas Eve, and there would be no shooting in her house tonight. The corporal demanded to know who was inside. Americans. Fritz felt his chest tighten. This was the moment when war usually wins. This was the moment when fear usually becomes violence. His mother did not panic. She did not beg. She did not try to create a complicated lie that could collapse. She spoke in a way that cut through uniforms and ideology. She spoke as a mother. She told him, plainly, that the men inside could be her sons, just as his men could be her sons. She told him there was a wounded boy fighting for his life and to friends who were lost, hungry, and exhausted, just like the German patrol. And she asked, in the simplest language of humanity, that on this night they forget the killing. The corporal hesitated. In that hesitation, you can feel the collision of everything he had been taught with everything he still was. He had orders. He had training. He had fear. He also had eyes. He could see a civilian home, a woman, a boy, and the exhaustion on his own men's faces. He could imagine the violence that would erupt in a small room. He could imagine, perhaps, what it would do to him to kill unarmed men in a cottage on Christmas Eve. He made a decision. The German soldiers laid their weapons down by the door. That act cannot be overstated. In war, the weapon is more than a tool. It is a shield for the mind. A man grips a rifle so he does not feel helpless. A rifle is how to keep your fear from swallowing you. Laying it down is stepping into vulnerability. It is the smallest form of trust, and in a world like the Ardennes in 1944, trust is a rare currency. Inside, Jim and Robin were stunned. Fritz's mother spoke in French, explaining what was happening. The Americans, tense and shocked, were asked to do something equally dangerous. They also surrendered their weapons. They handed them to Fritz's mother. She placed them aside. Now the cottage contained what should not have existed in the Battle of the Bulge. A room full of enemies, temporarily unarmed, held together by a single rule spoken by a woman who refused to let her home become a slaughterhouse. No shooting. Not here. Not tonight. They sat down at the table. At first, the air was tight. Every movement was measured. Every glance carried suspicion. Fear does not evaporate because someone says a holy word. Fear is a habit in war. But hunger and warmth are also powerful forces. As the meal began, as steam rose from food, as the stove radiated heat, bodies started to unclench. Fritz watched everything. He noticed how young the soldiers were. Two of the Germans, Heinz and Willy, were 16 years old. The corporal was 23, and he was the oldest. Think about that. The oldest man at the table was 23. War had turned teenagers into soldiers and called it normal. The Germans contributed what they could. The corporal produced a bottle of red wine from his pack. Someone produced rye bread, a precious thing in a winter of shortages. Fritz's mother cut the bread into small pieces so everyone could share. She set aside a portion of wine for the wounded Harry, still sleeping, still pale, still fighting his own private battle on the bed. Conversation was imperfect. French words, broken sentences, gestures. But meaning does not always need perfect grammar. They exchanged small facts, where someone was from, how long they had been marching, how cold it was, how hungry. They did not have to speak about politics. They did not have to explain why they were there. The war outside already screened those answers. Inside the cottage, what mattered was simpler. For a few hours, nobody would die. Then Fritz's mother prayed. She spoke a traditional line inviting Jesus to be their guest. Fritz noticed tears in her eyes, and then, looking around, he saw tears in the eyes of tired soldiers. Not dramatic sobbing, not theatrical emotion, but the quiet wetness of men who had been pretending to be hard for too long, and were suddenly reminded of home, of parents, of churches, of childhood, of the world before the war. They were not crying because they had become friends. They were crying because the war had forced them to become something unnatural. And for a moment, in that cottage, they were allowed to be human again. Near midnight, Fritz's mother stepped outside and called them to look at the Star of Bethlehem. They went out into the cold. Snow crunched under boots. The forest stood dark and still. The sky, for one moment, looked like a sky again. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, except for Harry, who slept inside. In that quiet, the war seemed distant, almost unreal, like a monstrous machine operating somewhere else. That is how fragile peace can be. It does not always arrive with flags. Sometimes it arrives with silence and a star. The truce lasted until morning. There was no paperwork. No commander approved it. No history book chapter was written that night. There was only a mutual agreement held together by exhaustion, hunger, a mother's courage, and the understanding that violence in that room would be meaningless and shameful. At dawn on Christmas Day, the two groups prepared to leave. They shook hands. The Germans went one direction. The Americans went another. And according to Fritz's memory, the German corporal even helped the Americans choose a route that would reduce their chance of walking directly into German positions. It was not strategy. It was not a secret alliance. It was the closing act of a night in which they had lowered their weapons, eaten together, and seen each other's faces in lamplight rather than muzzle flash. Then they vanished back into the forest, back into the war. The cottage became quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The stove still crackled. The smell of bread and wine lingered. There were crumbs on the table. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge continued, cold and savage. Somewhere nearby, other men were dying. Other families were fleeing. Other doors were being kicked in. War did not end because one cottage refused to host it. Asterisk, but Fritz had witnessed something that would not leave him. He had seen that even in the darkest winter fighting of the Second World War, a human choice could interrupt the machinery of violence for one night. He had seen that a mother could speak one sentence and force soldiers to remember they were once children. He had seen that fear does not always win. That is why people call it a Christmas truce. Not because it resembles the famous First World War truce in scale, but because it carries the same strange moral shock. In the middle of killing, someone chose mercy and others followed. And now, when the story might end, when the candle might go out and the camera might fade, another story begins. One that happened a year earlier in the sky over Germany. It is not Christmas. It is not a cottage. There is no table, no bread, no wine, no prayer spoken in the kitchen. Instead, there is an aircraft ripped open, limping through freezing air. There is a German fighter pilot with every legal and military reason to finish the job. And there is a decision in the sky that, like the cottage truce, feels impossible until you realize it was made by a human being, not a machine. This second story begins with an American bomber crew who believed they were about to die. It was December of 1943. Daylight bombing raids over Germany were among the most dangerous missions of the air war. The bomber crews flew deep into enemy territory, often for hours, exposed to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. And they knew that a single mission could turn into a fireball without warning. The cold at high altitude was severe. Metal became brittle, breath turned to frost, and fear, again, was constant. On one of those days, an American heavy bomber formation went in, and one bomber, a B-17, took a beating that would have made most people believe it could not possibly stay in the air. Anti-aircraft fire tore through it. Fighters chewed it. The aircraft was damaged badly. Parts of it were shredded. Systems failed. Men were injured. And when the bomber fell behind the formation, alone, limping, it became the kind of target that enemy fighters looked for. Isolated, vulnerable, easy to finish. Inside the bomber, the situation was grim. You have to picture what grim looks like at thousands of feet. It looks like smoke in cramped compartments. It looks like shattered plexiglass. It looks like oxygen masks and blood and metal fragments. It looks like men trying to keep their hands steady while the aircraft shudders and the engines scream at uneven power. It looks like the terrible knowledge that if the aircraft goes down over Germany, capture is likely if you survive, and death is likely if you do not. The crew did not feel heroic. They felt trapped in that moment. The sky is not a romantic place. It is a cold, violent corridor where you wait for the next strike. Then a German fighter appeared. A single-seat fighter closed in on the wounded bomber. For the bomber crew, this was the final sentence. A fighter at close range could tear them apart quickly. The bomber gunners were injured or their guns were damaged. They were in no condition to fight back effectively. If the fighter pilot wanted to finish them, he could do it, but the German fighter did not open fire. Instead, it came alongside, close enough that the bomber crew could see the pilot. Imagine the disbelief inside that bomber. Imagine you have been bracing for death, and now the enemy is right there, and nothing happens. The fighter's nose does not flash with gunfire. The bomber does not shudder from new impacts. The world pauses in a way that makes your mind struggle to process it. The German pilot took a long look at the bomber. He saw damage so severe that, depending on the angle, the aircraft looked like it had already been killed but did not yet know it. He saw holes. He saw missing sections. He saw wounded men visible through openings that should not have existed. In that second, the bomber stopped being a symbol of the enemy. It became a wounded animal struggling to stay aloft. And inside that animal were human beings. The fighter pilot had been trained to shoot. He had been trained to destroy bombers. He had a duty. He had a legal right. He had a war that demanded it. If he fired and the bomber fell, it would be counted as victory. He would be praised. It would be normal. But he hesitated. And like the German corporal in the cottage, that hesitation is the crack where humanity appears. The fighter pilot made a choice that carried risk. Not a soft risk, but a real one. In wartime air forces, mercy could look like disobedience. Letting an enemy go could be seen as betrayal. And yet, he chose a he signal. Not with words, but with position, with motion. With the kind of communication pilots used when languages differed, but intentions could still be understood. He did not want the bomber to fly deeper into danger. He wanted it out. He wanted it away from anti-aircraft zones and away from more fighters. So instead of attacking, he escorted. He flew alongside the wounded bomber. guiding it toward a safer direction, effectively shepherding it toward the edge of the danger zone, not because he loved the enemy, not because he suddenly believed the war was wrong, but because, at close range, he saw something that did not fit propaganda: wounded young men who would die. If he pulled the trigger in the bomber, the crew could not fully understand what was happening. They were terrified of tricks. In war, trust can get you killed. But the fighter pilot did not maneuver for a kill. He stayed with them, close enough to protect them from other threats, and he kept his guns silent. Then, at the point where the bomber could continue on its own toward safety, the fighter pilot broke away, but even that breakaway carried a final gesture, a salute, a brief sign that said, in the simplest language of human recognition, "I am letting you go." And then he turned back toward Germany, back toward his own world of orders and danger. The bomber crew returned to their side. They lived out. The war continued. Bombs fell again. Fighters fought again. Men died again. But that one encounter lodged itself in memory the way the cottage truce lodged in Fritz's memory, because it was so unexpected that it became impossible to forget. What makes that air encounter similar to the cottage story is not the holiday. It is the structure of the moment. In both stories, a human being stands at the edge of violence with every reason to commit it, and instead chooses restraint. In both stories, the restraint is not an abstract principle. It is a concrete action, weapons laid down at a door, guns kept silent in the sky. In both stories, the moment is short. It does not end the war. It does not cleanse the world. It simply proves that even in a system built around killing, a person can still decide to behave differently. Now, why do stories like these matter, especially to a broad audience, including young viewers who might not know the details of the Second World War? They matter because they do not ask you to pretend the war was kind. The war was not kind. The Battle of the Bulge was brutal. The air war over Germany was brutal. People suffered enormously. These stories do not erase that. Instead, they show something else. They show that war does not fully erase the human soul. Even when it tries. In the cottage, a mother looked at armed men and spoke to them as sons. That is a deeply human act. It is also a dangerous act. It is a reminder that courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is refusing to be bullied by the moral collapse around you. Sometimes courage is insisting on one small rule. In my home, tonight, you will not kill. In the sky, a fighter pilot looked at a wounded bomber and saw people instead of targets. That is also a deeply human act. It is a reminder that morality does not always vanish in war. It can be buried. It can be suppressed. It can be punished. But it sometimes surfaces in one decision made in seconds, and yet, it would be dishonest to tell these stories as if they are simple lessons. They are not simple. They are complicated because mercy in war can be dangerous. Mercy can be misunderstood. Mercy can be used against you. Mercy can even conflict with duty. That is why these moments are rare. That is why they feel shocking, because they require a person to step outside the normal logic of survival and orders and fear, and to act as if the enemy is human, even though the war tells you that seeing the enemy as human might weaken you. But here is the truth that connects both stories. The people in them did not act out of softness. They acted out of strength. It takes strength to keep your hands steady when fear is screaming at you to strike first. It takes strength to hold a roll of peace in a room full of soldiers. It takes strength to escort an enemy aircraft when your entire training says you should destroy it. In both stories, the strongest force in the room or in the sky was not the rifle or the machine gun. It was restraint. After the cottage night, Fritz and his mother did not become famous in the moment. They did not receive medals. They still had to survive a war that did not care about one peaceful meal. They still had to endure a winter that remained dangerous. Fritz remained a boy surrounded by adults in uniform. But the memory remained, and that memory became a kind of torch. It illuminated the fact that even in the worst conditions, a person can choose to behave with dignity. After the air encounter, the bomber crew and the fighter pilot did not instantly become friends. The war did not allow such easy endings, but the memory remained. It haunted and comforted at once, because it was proof that the enemy could make a choice that was not purely violent. Now consider what Christmas means in these stories. Christmas, for many people, symbolizes peace, family, and the idea of goodwill. In war, Christmas often becomes painful because it reminds you of what you are missing. It reminds you of home. It reminds you of childhood. It reminds you that there was once a world where a door knocking at night meant a neighbor, not a soldier. In the cottage story, Christmas becomes the lever that the mother uses. Asterisk asterisk, she does not argue politics. She does not argue strategy. She argues a holiday, a shared cultural idea that even soldiers might still recognize as sacred. She uses that recognition to force a pause. Asterisk asterisk. In the Air story, it is not Christmas itself that forces the pause, but it is still December, still a time when the mind can drift toward home and memory, and perhaps that drift makes a pilot's hesitation possible. You cannot prove it, and you do not need to. The point is that in both stories, the war did not completely succeed in turning people into machines. For viewers of any age, that is the heart of why these stories stay with you. They are not fairy tales. They are not saying everything was fine. They are saying something more realistic and more challenging, even in the worst circumstances. A human being can still choose to act as a human being. And here is another important piece that makes both stories accessible. The heroes are not superheroes. They are ordinary people trapped in extraordinary conditions. A mother with a pot of food and a child. A corporal and a few teenagers lost from their unit. Two exhausted American soldiers supporting a wounded friend. A fighter pilot making a decision in seconds, alone in the cockpit. These are not figures carved in marble. These are people with cold hands and fear in their stomachs. Now let us return, briefly, to the morning after the cottage truce. Because the morning shows the quiet cost of such a night. When the soldiers left, the cottage did not become a peaceful holiday home. It returned to being a fragile shelter near a battlefield. The sound of the war did not stop. The mother did not suddenly become safe. Fritz did not suddenly become a child in peacetime. But something in them changed. Fritz had seen adults choose not to kill. That is a powerful thing for a child to see. In a war that teaches children that violence is normal, seeing restraint becomes a counter-teaching. It becomes a memory that could shape a life. And it is worth emphasizing why the mother's risk was so extreme. She was caught between armed groups. If either side decided she was helping the enemy, she could die. She did not have the protection of a uniform. She did not have the leverage of rank. She had only her home and her voice. That is why her authority in that moment feels almost miraculous. She built it out of moral clarity, out of maternal force, and out of the fact that even soldiers sometimes still feel shamed. In the Air story, the risk was different, but still real. A fighter pilot who lets an enemy go can be punished if discovered. Even if not punished, he can be haunted by the knowledge that he broke the expected code of war. But he did it anyway. That is why the salute matters. The salute is not just a gesture. It is a statement. I see you. I acknowledge you. I am making this choice knowingly. Now imagine the bomber crew after they returned. Imagine how they told the story. How do you tell people that the enemy did not shoot when he could have? How do you describe it without making it sound like a dream? You would likely repeat the details again and again. Because repeating details is how the mind confirms reality. The distance, the look of the pilot, the lack of gunfire, the escort, the salute. Stories like that become anchors, because they show that the world is not always what your fear says it is. And yet, it is crucial to say something that keeps this documentary honest. These stories do not represent the whole war. They are exceptions. The Second World War contained immense suffering and countless moments of cruelty. The Battle of the Bulge saw atrocities and terrible losses. The Air War saw cities burned and crews killed. These stories shine because they are rare. They are small lights in a long tunnel. Their value is not that they prove the tunnel was bright. Their value is that they prove the light can exist at all. So why combine these two stories into one narrative? Because together they reveal a pattern. In both cases, the war created a situation where one side had power over the other. In the cottage, the German patrol had the power to kill. In the sky, the German fighter had the power to destroy. In both cases, the person with power chose not to use it. That is the central documentary point. Morality is most visible when it is inconvenient, when it is risky, when it goes against the easy path. And if you want to understand human nature, that is where you look. The older you get, the more you realize that most people are not purely good or purely evil. Most people are mixtures shaped by pressure. War is pressure. War does not create everything inside a person, but it reveals it. It reveals what happens when fear is constant. It reveals what happens when a person is tired and hungry and told that the enemy is not human. In that pressure, some people become cruel, others become numb, and a few, in rare moments, become unexpectedly merciful. In the cottage, the mother forced mercy into existence by setting a rule and daring soldiers to break it. In the sky, Mercy emerged from a pilot's internal decision, made without witnesses, made with no applause waiting. That difference matters. It shows that mercy can be social, enforced by community and shame, and it can also be private, enforced by conscience alone. Now, if you are listening and you are young, you might wonder, would I do the same? Would I open the door? Would I lay down the rifle? Would I escort the enemy? The honest answer is that you do not know until you are tested. And most people are never tested in such ways. But you can learn something simpler and more useful for everyday life. You can learn that it is possible to pause, to see another person, and to choose restraint when anger and fear would rather you strike. That is the accessible lesson, not a political lesson, not a military lesson, a human lesson. And for older listeners, there's another layer. These stories are reminders that the line between enemy and neighbor can be thinner than we like to admit. In a different context, the German teenagers in the cottage could have been boys in school. The American soldiers could have been friends. The fighter pilot could have been a man you would meet at a market. War rearranges people into categories, then tells them those categories are permanent. These stories show the categories can crack under the weight of reality. Let us also consider the role of exhaustion, because exhaustion is a hidden character in both stories. The cottage truce happened because everyone involved was exhausted. The American soldiers were lost and desperate. The German patrol was lost and desperate. The mother was exhausted from survival. Fritz was exhausted from fear. In exhaustion, certain masks fall away. The arrogance of ideology can weaken when your body is cold and your stomach is empty. That is not romantic. That is biology. It is why the truce felt possible for one night. The war had drained everyone down. The basic human needs. The air encounter also involved exhaustion, though of a different kind. Air crews were exhausted from missions. Fighter pilots were exhausted from constant danger. The pilot who escorted the bomber was not a cold machine. He was a man who had likely seen death many times. That repetition can make people cruel, but it can also make them more aware of how fragile life is. Sometimes, after too much death, a person becomes determined not to add one more unnecessary death. Now, you might ask, why did the cottage mother have such authority over armed men? Why did they listen? Because she created a moment of moral clarity. She framed the situation in the simplest terms possible. These are young men. One is wounded. It is Christmas Eve. No shooting in my home. She did not give them an argument they could debate. She gave them a boundary. Boundaries can be powerful, especially when everyone secretly wants an excuse to step back from violence. And why did the fighter pilot not shoot? Because he saw the crew, not the mission, not the target. The crew. He saw vulnerability at close range. Vulnerability can trigger cruelty in some people. In others, it triggers mercy. In that moment, it triggered mercy. That is the uncomfortable truth. We are not all the same under pressure. These stories are reminders to choose who you want to be before pressure arrives. As this combined documentary segment comes to a close, it is worth painting one final image of each story, because images are what stay in memory. The first image is a small German cottage in a dark forest, a stove radiating heat, a table with potatoes, bread, and wine, a wounded young man asleep on a bed, American soldiers and German soldiers sitting in the same room, their weapons stacked by the door like something from a different planet, a mother praying with tears in her eyes, a 12-year-old boy watching the faces of enemies soften into something almost familiar. Outside, the distant guns continue, but inside, for one night, the war is not allowed to enter. The second image is a bomber, damaged and struggling, alone in cold air. A German fighter sliding into position beside it, close enough to see inside, close enough to destroy it, and then choosing not to. The fighter staying near, guiding, escorting, as if protecting an enemy from worse danger. And then, before turning away, a salute in the sky. A gesture so small and so clear that it becomes unforgettable. These are not stories of victory. They are stories of restraint. They are not stories that deny the horror of war. They are stories that show something can survive inside the horror. And that is why, decades later, people still tell them. Because in a world that often feels loud and angry, it matters to remember that even in the Second World War, in the coldest places and the cruelest times, a mother once said no shooting, and soldiers listened. And a pilot once kept his gun silent, and strangers lived. ***.